My son once told me I was his hero. He was 7 and he'd drawn a picture of me in a cape holding a spoon because I'd made his favorite spaghetti after a nightmare. He said, "You always fix everything, Mom." I kept that drawing in a box labeled important. 38 years later, the same son would stand beside the woman who screamed at me to get out of the wedding I paid for and say nothing, not a word, not a blink, just silence. And that's when I knew I wasn't anyone's hero anymore. I was just convenient. I live in a modest 2-bedroom house by Lake Michigan. It's the kind of home that cracks in winter and smells like cedar in summer. I've lived here alone since Harold passed 12 years ago. He was a steady man, quiet, loyal, allergic to small talk. We married at 23, built our life slowly, and raised Jacob with the kind of love that makes you forget how tired you are. When Harold got sick, Jacob was in grad school. I told him not to come home. I'd handle it. I always did. Now I'm 73, retired from a long career as a grief counselor. And sometimes I wonder if I knew too much about healing and not enough about preventing hurt. Jacob calls occasionally, mostly when something's broken or when there's a holiday he feels obligated to check off. Still, I saved every voicemail. They sound different when there's no one else calling. A few weeks ago, he announced he was getting married. I didn't know he was seeing anyone seriously. "Her name's Amanda," he said over the phone. "She's amazing, confident, super organized. You'll love her." I smiled even though no one could see me. "And we'd really like to do it at Hollow Creek Vineyard. It's beautiful. Amanda's dream spot, but it's pricey. So, we were hoping you might be willing to help us out, Mom." Of course. He didn't ask me directly. That was never his style. It was more like a test to see how far I'd bend without breaking. I didn't even hesitate. "Of course," I said, "whatever you need." He sounded relieved, genuinely grateful for a moment. "Thanks, Mom. I'll send over the initial contract." 2 days later, a courier dropped off a folder thicker than a phone book. Venue deposit, catering projections, dress fittings, flower mock-ups, seat maps, all printed and ready for a signature. The vineyard required a non-refundable deposit of $48,000. I didn't blink. I just signed. That night, I made chamomile tea, sat by the window, and thought about the last time Jacob hugged me. Not one of those stiff half-hugs, but a real one. Maybe his high school graduation. I wasn't sure, but I remember how tightly he held me when Harold passed. How he let himself cry on my shoulder like he had as a little boy. I'd never asked for that again. But maybe, just maybe, this wedding would bring us back to something closer than voicemail love. Amanda called me 3 days after the check cleared. She sounded rehearsed, chipper, polished. "Hi, Judith. Just wanted to say thank you again for making our dream wedding possible. Jacob always says you're incredible." I thanked her for the call. I meant it. But something in her tone felt transactional, like I'd bought my seat at their table. Not earned it, not belonged to it. Just paid my way in. Still, I stayed hopeful. Hope is funny that way. It clings to people who don't deserve it and grows quietly like moss on cold stone. The next week, Amanda sent me a style guide for the wedding. Lavender, silver, white. No brooches, no collars, nothing too vintage. I laughed softly. Too vintage must have been code for too much like you. I set it aside and pulled out the sky blue dress I wore to Harold's retirement party. It still fit. But would I? Sometimes I look around this house and feel like a museum exhibit. Photos of people who don't visit anymore. A dining table that only seats one. The garden still blooms every spring whether anyone notices or not. Just like I do, I suppose. Jacob hasn't come by once since the engagement. Everything is texts and links. "Mom, what do you think of these chairs?" "Mom, Amanda says the caterer needs your sign-off." "There's no how are you?" "No want to grab coffee?" But I respond to every message, pay every invoice, because that's what mothers do, right? I started keeping a notebook again, just one of those spiral-bound ones from the drugstore. I jot down things I won't say out loud. Sentences like, "Sometimes it feels like I'm being erased one polite thank you at a time. And if I vanish tomorrow, Who would know first, the florist or my son? But I also write things like, "You are not invisible just because they don't see you." I say that a lot to the women who read my blog and sometimes to myself. This might not look like your typical revenge story. There's no courtroom, no confrontation, no thrown wine glass, just a woman, a mother quietly watching the people she loves turn away from her, then deciding softly but finally not to follow. And sometimes that's the most powerful kind of revenge of all. 3 weeks before the wedding, Amanda emailed me a revised seating chart. No greeting, no context, just a PDF with rows and rows of names. I enlarged it on my computer screen, squinting to find mine. It was there, table 9, sandwiched between someone named Uncle Darrell and family friend Patty, +1. Jacob wasn't at my table. Neither was Amanda. Neither were any names I recognized. I replied, "Hi, Amanda. Just confirming, is this the final seating arrangement?" I didn't see myself near Jacob or immediate family. She wrote back in under 5 minutes. "Hi, Judith. Yes, this is the plan the photographer approved. Symmetry is key for pictures. Thank you for understanding." Understanding, that word again. When did I become someone people assumed would just quietly understand? That night, I sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water and stared at that chart. Table 9, near the kitchen door, behind a column. I knew that spot. I'd been seated there at someone else's wedding years ago. It was where the servers bumped your chair every time they came out with a tray. I didn't call Jacob. I knew what he'd say. "Mom, don't make this a thing." It already was a thing, but I swallowed it down like I had so many times before. A few days later, I stopped by the bridal shop Amanda had recommended to pick up the dress she'd approved. The clerk handed it to me in silence, like we were trading in contraband. Pale lavender, sleeveless, with a neckline I wouldn't have dared wear at 50, let alone 73. "It's what she wanted," the clerk whispered. I nodded. I hung the dress in my guest room closet and shut the door. You know, sometimes I wonder, do people think we don't notice when we're being pushed aside? That we don't see the way our names are moved down the list, our opinions filed under not needed? Maybe it's easier for them to pretend we're too old to care, but we notice. Oh, we notice everything. I started writing in my notebook more scribbled late-night thoughts, lists, fragments of sentences I didn't have the nerve to say out loud. One page just said, "I raised a boy who doesn't see me anymore." I stared at that line for a long time. Ladies watching this, have you ever felt like that? Like the very child you gave your life to suddenly looks past you like a stranger? I don't mean to pull at wounds, but if this has happened to you, let me know. Maybe we're more alike than we think. The next day, Jacob called, not to ask how I was, but to talk about the wine selection. "Amanda's worried about the quality," he said. "She wants to go with the French import, not the California blend." "The French one is double the price," I said gently. "And we already confirmed the caterer's list." He hesitated. "She just wants everything perfect, Mom." "Of course she does. I'll see what I can do," I said, though I had no idea how I'd stretch the budget. The bank account wasn't bottomless, but I didn't say that either. I hung up and went to the drawer with Harold's old notebook. Inside was a spreadsheet he'd used to track retirement savings, trip plans, even gift logs. He always wrote in pencil, so nothing feels too permanent, he'd say. There was a line on the last page in his neat block letters, "Judith's safety fund, no matter what." I traced over it with my finger. I hadn't touched that money yet. I wouldn't. Not for this. A week later, Amanda stopped by the house with her planner in tow. She glanced around my living room like it was a thrift store display. "So many sentimental pieces," she said with a polite smile. "Harold built that bookshelf," I said. "Oh," she replied, moving on. She pulled out a binder and flipped to a page. "We're finalizing the family photos. Just need to confirm who's in which frame." I nodded. "I'd love to be in one with Jacob, of course." "Oh," she said again, that same tone. "We're actually doing a minimal set. Parents, siblings, bridal party. Maybe we can grab one casual shot of you and Jacob during cocktails." "Casual?" I repeated. She didn't notice the way I gripped my mug a little tighter. She went through more logistics, hardly looking up timing, flowers, dress code. I wasn't in any of it, just someone being briefed, not included. When she left, she said, "Thanks again for being so chill about everything. Most moms are a nightmare." I smiled. I'm good at that now, smiling at people who call me chill instead of discarded. After she left, I took a walk around the lake behind my house. The wind was strong. It pushed at my back, made me feel like I was being urged forward. Maybe I was. I sat on the bench Harold and I used to read on together, pulled out my phone, and opened my notes app. At the top of a new page, I wrote, "If you're not invited to the table, bring a chair, and if they take your chair, bring the truth." I didn't know yet how those words would come back to me, but they would. And when they did, they'd be printed in black ink and slipped under wine glasses and folded napkins, and they would not be ignored. The rehearsal dinner was Friday evening at a country club 2 towns over. An upscale place with high ceilings, white piano music, and staff who say madam even when they're clearly talking to someone's grandmother. I knew this because I looked it up online, not because anyone told me where it was. I wasn't invited. Not directly, at least. Jacob had called me 3 days prior. I remember it clearly because I was cleaning out Harold's old desk drawer and had just found a tie clip I hadn't seen in years. "Hey, Mom," Jacob said casually. "So, Friday's going to be a bit tight with everything going on, and Amanda thought it might be best if you just come straight to the ceremony Saturday." I paused, confused. "You mean not come to the rehearsal?" "Yeah, just to keep things simple." Simple. That word again. I asked, "Is Amanda's mother going?" "Yeah, of course. She's handling the seating plan with the planner." "And her dad?" "Yeah, he's giving a short toast." "But not me." Silence. Then Jacob let out a little breath. "Mom, I knew you'd make this a thing. It's not that big of a deal. You'll be at the ceremony. That's what matters." I didn't respond right away. My hands felt cold. I looked down at the tie clip in my palm and thought about how I'd stood beside Jacob at every parent-teacher conference, every school play, every college tour, and now I wasn't worthy of standing beside him before his wedding. "Okay," I said quietly. "If that's what you want." "It's just easier," he said, almost relieved. "Thanks for understanding." That night, I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at my phone for a long time. I opened my messages and scrolled through our past conversations. Mostly one-liners from him about money or updates Amanda had asked him to pass along. Nothing warm, nothing just between us. I started to type something. "You're hurting me," but I erased it. I'm not sure why. Maybe because I already knew he wouldn't hear it. Friday night came and went. I didn't go anywhere. I stayed in my house, lit a lavender candle, and made myself a cup of soup. While I ate, I listened to the jazz records Harold used to play when we were young. The house felt quiet, but not peaceful, like it was holding its breath. I didn't cry. I thought I might, but sometimes the pain goes too deep for tears. It just sits there, heavy, familiar. Around 8:30 p.m., Charlie called. My sweet grandson, now 23 and infinitely more thoughtful than his father. "Hi, Grandma," he said. "I just left the rehearsal." "Oh," I replied. "How was it?" There was a pause. Strange. Dad looked tense the whole time. Amanda was Amanda. I smiled faintly. "That sounds about right." "Why weren't you there?" he asked, voice sharp with confusion. "I wasn't invited," I said simply. "What?" His voice cracked. "You're his mother." I guess they thought it would be less complicated this way. "Less complicated for who?" he snapped. "You're not just a guest. You're the one paying for half this thing." "Charlie," I said gently, "please don't stir things up on my behalf. It won't help." He went quiet for a second. Then, "I just don't get it. You raised him. You've given him everything." I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. He already understood what I hadn't dared admit aloud. Saturday morning arrived with bright skies and birdsong. One of those crisp Michigan mornings where even the wind feels like it's trying to be polite. I woke early, showered, and laid out the dress Amanda had approved. Lavender, Modest neckline, soft fabric. It wasn't me, but it wasn't terrible either. I fastened the pearl earrings Harold had given me on our 25th anniversary. I debated taking them off. Amanda had said no pearls, but I left them in anyway. Some small part of me needed to feel like myself. The cab Jacob ordered pulled up exactly at 10. The driver was kind, helped me in, didn't make small talk, just the way I like it. As we pulled into the vineyard, I saw white tents, flower arrangements, a string quartet already tuning up. Everything looked flawless. Everything also looked like it belonged to someone else's life. At the front gate, a young assistant waved us through and pointed toward a side path. Family guests are asked to wait in the library until called, she said. I nodded and walked slowly toward the old stone building at the back of the property. Inside, the library smelled of lemon polish and dried roses. The books were arranged by color, more for aesthetics than reading. A chair was waiting for me near the window, and a tray of tea and cookies had already been laid out. I sat alone. The clock ticked. No one came in. I poured myself a cup of tea and stared out at the vineyard, watching people bustle around, laughing, directing, decorating. I wasn't part of any of it. And I knew then with startling clarity that this was my role in their story. The mother who wrote the check but not the speech. Who brought the money but not the meaning. But maybe, just maybe, that was about to change. Because I had something they hadn't planned for, something written, something true. And very soon, everyone at that reception would be reading it. The morning of the wedding was crisp, almost too perfect. Blue skies, warm sun, and not a single cloud in sight. The kind of weather you pray for when you're planning a lakeside ceremony. I'd woken up early, ironed my dress, and clipped on my pearl earrings, despite Amanda's earlier suggestion to avoid anything too classic. I looked at myself in the mirror and whispered, "You look fine, Judith. Dignified is not a crime." The cab pulled up right on time, and I watched the vineyard come into view with all its grandeur, white tents, garden arches, champagne flutes lined up like soldiers. It was beautiful, painfully so. At the front, a young assistant waved me through and pointed me toward a side path. Family guests are waiting in the library. I was escorted into a room that smelled like old books and new paint. A single tray of cookies sat untouched on the table. No music, no laughter, just me and a clock ticking too loud in the silence. After 20 minutes of sitting alone, I decided to take a short walk through the garden, just to breathe, not to intrude. I followed a cobbled path toward the terrace where the ceremony had just ended. The arch still stood glittering in the sunlight. White rose petals littered the grass. That's when I heard my name. Judith. I turned and saw Amanda still in her gown, bouquet in hand. Her eyes were sharp, her mouth curled tight. "I've been looking for you," she said through gritted teeth. "Why are you wandering around?" "I was just taking some air," I replied calmly. She looked over her shoulder, then stepped closer. "You're drawing attention to yourself." "I didn't mean to," I said softly. Amanda's voice dropped, but her anger sharpened. "You always do this. Always have to be seen. Jacob told me all about it. How you smothered him, tried to run every part of his life." I blinked, stunned. "That's not true." "Oh, please," she hissed. "You raised him to need you. Now that he's chosen me, you can't handle it." I stood there, heart thudding. My hands shook slightly, but I kept them at my sides. "Let's not do this here," I said, trying to stay composed. "You're not welcome in our pictures," she snapped. "You've already done enough." There were gasps behind me. I turned to find a small group of guests, people I didn't know, watching. Some had half-drunk champagne in hand, frozen in awkward silence. That's when Jacob appeared. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice tight. Amanda pointed at me. "She's trying to ruin our day. I told her not to wander off, and here she is, pulling attention." I looked at Jacob, my son, the boy I'd raised with night shifts and whispered bedtime stories. I searched his eyes for something, anything that resembled the child I once knew. "She didn't mean to," he mumbled. "Just go back inside, Mom." My chest tightened. "Do you really think I'd try to ruin your wedding?" He didn't answer. Amanda folded her arms. I want her gone. I'm serious. I looked at Jacob one more time. He wasn't angry. He wasn't sad. He just looked embarrassed, like I was a mistake that needed fixing. Okay, I said. My voice didn't shake. I'll go. No one stopped me. Not Jacob, not Amanda, not a single guest. Only Charlie appeared at the edge of the crowd, stepping forward like he was about to say something. I caught his eye and shook my head gently. I wouldn't let him be caught in the middle of this. I walked away slowly down the gravel path toward the parking lot. Each step felt like peeling something off my chest, like shedding a version of myself I no longer needed to carry. Inside the coat room, I handed my claim ticket to the attendant, retrieved my shawl, and waited for the cab Jacob had arranged. It pulled up 5 minutes later. As I stepped inside, the driver looked at me through the rearview mirror. Leaving already? He asked. Yes, I replied. The ceremony is over. He nodded and pulled away from the estate. I didn't look back. Back at home, the silence was familiar, but not quite the same. This time, it felt like something had closed behind me, and I hadn't just stepped out of a wedding. I'd stepped out of a role I'd played for far too long. The next morning, I turned on my phone. 4 missed calls, 2 voicemails, 1 from Jacob, 1 from the wedding planner. But the one that mattered was the voicemail from Charlie. Grandma, I don't know what happened, but I'm so sorry. You didn't deserve that. I'm coming by tomorrow, okay? I love you. I held the phone to my chest and let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I didn't cry. I didn't scream, but I made a decision. I walked to my desk, opened the drawer, and pulled out 20 crisp envelopes. Each one already labeled with the names of guests I recognized from the seating chart. Then I pulled out the letter I drafted days ago, the one I'd written in my notebook, the one I wasn't sure I'd use. I copied it word for word into 20 identical notes, simple, honest, unapologetic. Then I sealed each envelope. They'd be delivered later that evening, placed carefully under wine glasses and folded napkins. I wasn't going to make a scene at the wedding. But the truth was about to take its seat at every single table. The morning after the wedding, I felt something I hadn't in years. Clarity. Not anger, not bitterness, just a steady stillness. Like the quiet after a long storm when the world finally stopped spinning. I made a cup of tea and sat at my kitchen table watching the steam rise. The phone buzzed constantly from the counter. Calls from Jacob, Amanda, the wedding planner, even a number I didn't recognize. I let it all ring. I already knew why they were calling. Because last night, while the newlyweds danced under string lights and posed for photos, a quiet ripple moved through the reception. It started with a single guest opening a white envelope at table 3. Inside, they found a letter. Not dramatic, not cruel, just honest. It read, "You're enjoying a beautiful wedding, and I'm glad. But I hope you know it was paid for by someone who wasn't invited to the rehearsal, someone who was seated far from her son. Someone who was told her presence ruined the pictures. My name is Judith Emerson. I'm the groom's mother. I signed every check, arranged every deposit, and was asked to disappear in return. If this surprises you, imagine how it felt to live it. No one had expected it. Not Amanda, not Jacob, not the guests politely sipping overpriced champagne. The letters had been placed by a courier just before the dinner began. One at every table, nestled under folded napkins beside the menu cards. I hadn't needed to be in the spotlight. I just wanted the truth to sit quietly where I wasn't allowed to. And it did. By the time the first course was served, I'd become the topic of every whispered conversation in the room. Charlie texted me around 9 p.m. Grandma, did you do this? I replied with 3 words. Yes, I did. He didn't text back for a while, then good. Now, the day after, as my phone buzzed like a beehive of apologies and explanations, I simply stirred honey into my tea and waited for the knock on the door. It came just before noon. Jacob. He looked like he hadn't slept. His tie was crooked, his shirt wrinkled. The man who'd once run to me with scraped knees and birthday cards now looked like someone avoiding a debt collector. Mom, he started, stepping inside without waiting for me to invite him. What the hell was that? I stayed seated. You read it, didn't you? Of course I read it. So did Amanda's boss, her uncle, her friends, everyone. I nodded slowly. Good. Jacob ran a hand through his hair. You humiliated us. No, I said calmly. I told the truth. What you did, what Amanda did, that was the humiliation. I just let people know who paid for their wine glasses. His mouth opened then closed. I continued, you asked me to pay for a wedding and disappear at the same time. You and Amanda made sure I had no voice, no seat, no place in your life. I accepted that until you asked me to accept being erased entirely. I didn't mean to hurt you, he said quietly. But you did. He sat down across from me, his shoulders slumped. You could have just said something. I did, Jacob, I said. Not in words, maybe, but I did. Every time I paid another invoice. Every time I was told to stay out of the way, and I stayed. Every time Amanda rolled her eyes and you didn't say a word, I was screaming on the inside. He stared at the table. I sighed. This isn't about ruining your day. It's about reclaiming mine. I've spent decades being the mother who makes things happen and never asks for credit. I thought maybe just once I'd get to be seen. Instead, I got pushed out. Jacob shook his head. Amanda's furious. Her parents are demanding we issue some kind of statement. Let them. He looked at me like he didn't recognize me. Maybe he didn't. You've changed, he said. I've stopped accepting less than I deserve, I replied. That's not the same thing. There was a long silence. Then he asked the question I'd been waiting for. Are you still paying the remaining balance? I smiled, not cruel, but with the kind of smile you wear when you finally set something down that was never yours to carry. No, Jacob, I said. The agreement was that I'd support a wedding I was included in. That agreement was broken by you. But the vendors, Mom, they're going to come after us. I suggest you speak to Amanda about what elegance really costs. He stood up abruptly. You're seriously doing this after everything? I stood too. I'm doing this because of everything. He didn't say goodbye. He just left. When the door closed behind him, I felt no triumph, no glee, only peace. Not the kind you feel when everything goes right, but the kind that comes when you finally stop pretending it is. Later that afternoon, I got a message from Charlie. They're freaking out, but you? You did what no one else could. You made them listen. I replied with a heart emoji. First time I'd ever used one. That evening, I took a walk by the lake. The sun was low, turning the water gold. Ducks drifted near the reeds. Somewhere nearby, someone was playing piano through an open window. And me, I was just a woman walking home, lighter, freer, and no longer holding space for people who wouldn't hold it back. 1 week later, my phone was quiet. Not silent, just different. The kind of quiet you get after a storm has passed. People had stopped calling. The initial firestorm of Amanda's family demanding explanations had burned out, leaving only cold smoke behind. No apology from Jacob, no message from Amanda, not even a thank you note for the thousands I'd already paid. But I hadn't expected one. What did come surprisingly was a letter handwritten on thick ivory stationery from Amanda's aunt, of all people. Judith, I don't know what happened behind the scenes, but I read your letter, and I just want you to know it changed the way I looked at everything. I'm sorry you were treated that way, and I'm sorry I didn't notice sooner. That letter sat on my mantle for days. Not because I needed the validation, but because it was the first time someone saw what others ignored. That weekend, I cancelled the final 2 payments to the florist and the DJ. I also withdrew the deposit for the post-honeymoon brunch Amanda had planned. I sent the refunded money to a small charity I used to volunteer with, a center for women over 60 rebuilding after loss. Jacob never responded. Instead, Charlie came by. He brought flowers, daisies, my favorite, and 2 pastries from the corner bakery. We sat on the porch with coffee and silence, the comfortable kind that says, I see you without needing words. After a while, he asked, do you miss him? I didn't answer right away. I thought about the little boy who used to sit on my lap while I read Goodnight Moon. I thought about the teenager who cried into my shoulder the first time his heart got broken. And then I thought about the man who stood by while his bride told me to get out. I miss who he used to be, I finally said. But I don't miss who he is now. Charlie just nodded. He already understood. Later that day, I went to my garden. It was small, just 3 raised beds and a row of lavender along the fence, but it had always been mine. I knelt down, gloved hands in the dirt, pruning and trimming like I'd done 100 times before. But this time, it felt different. Not like escaping, more like reclaiming. You know, people always assume when an older woman steps back, it's because she's tired. But sometimes we step back because we've finally had enough. Let me ask you something, especially if you've been through anything like this. Have you ever stayed quiet to keep the peace until one day you realized the only one paying for that peace was you? If you've ever reached that moment, tell me below. You're not alone. Not even close. The following week, Amanda posted an Instagram story, a black and white photo captioned, "Some people can't stand not being the center of attention." I didn't respond, but I noticed something strange. Only a handful of likes, no comments. The woman who lived for applause was suddenly clapping for herself in an empty room. A few days later, Jacob's company website changed. His bio used to say, "Happily married, proud son." Now it just read, "Operations lead, dog dad." A small detail, but telling. Then, 2 weeks after the wedding, I received a phone call from the same vineyard where the wedding had taken place. "Ms. Emerson," the voice said gently, "we had a lovely couple cancel their full reservation, and we remembered your name. You were so thoughtful during the booking. Would you be interested in taking the slot?" I smiled into the receiver. "No, thank you, but I appreciate it." I hung up and laughed to myself. Thoughtful. That's what I'd been called. Not difficult, not controlling, not bitter, thoughtful. I went inside and opened my drawer of letters, my copies, my version of events. I took one and mailed it to myself, stamped and sealed. Because sometimes the only validation you really need is your own voice echoing back to you. That evening, I sat on the porch again, feet tucked under me, the sun sliding low across the lawn. A neighbor walked by and waved. "Haven't seen you around lately." I smiled, just taking care of things. And I had, not by shouting, not by demanding, but by remembering who I was before someone told me to sit in the back and be quiet. Before I believed that sacrifice was supposed to be invisible. Now, when I walk into a room, I don't ask myself if I'm welcome. I decide if the room deserves me. And that's the real revenge story. The kind where you don't need to win out loud because peace is louder than any applause you'll never get. It's funny how a quiet morning can feel like a new chapter, even if nothing looks different. Same sun coming through the window, same kettle on the stove, same old porch swing creaking in the breeze. But everything inside me had changed. It had been 3 weeks since the wedding. No calls from Jacob, no visits, just silence. And not the painful kind anymore. It was a clean silence, the kind that lets you hear yourself again. I'd started doing something new. Every Sunday, I drove 15 minutes to a small cafe on the edge of town. Nothing fancy, just good coffee, fresh muffins, and tables by the window where no one rushed you to leave. The first time I went, I brought a book. The second time, a journal. Now I just go as I am, and that feels like enough. There's a woman there, Linda, who works the counter, probably around my age, maybe a little younger. She wears bright scarves and always has a pen tucked behind her ear. The first Sunday, she asked, "Table for one?" And I said, yes, without shame, for the first time in years. By the 3rd week, she knew my order by heart. "Chamomile tea, cranberry scone, and a window seat," she said with a wink. "Make it 2 scones today," I replied. "One for now, one for the walk home." She smiled like she understood something unspoken. Sometimes that's all it takes. Back at home, I started a new project. I opened a box I hadn't touched in over a decade. The one filled with Harold's old sketchbooks. I'd forgotten how often he used to draw me when I wasn't looking. Little pencil outlines of me reading, cooking, laughing with Jacob as a boy. He wasn't a great artist, but he caught something in the way he looked at me. Something I hadn't seen in a long time. I decided to frame one of the sketches and hang it in the hallway. Not for decoration, but for remembrance, for dignity. That same afternoon, I signed up for an online writing workshop. It wasn't fancy, just a small group of older women who gathered via Zoom to write short memoirs. I introduced myself and said, "My name is Judith. I'm 73 and I've recently remembered how to use my voice again." They welcomed me like I'd never been gone. And that felt like a kind of home I hadn't known I needed. I wrote about the garden, about Sunday mornings, about the day I stood in a vineyard in a lavender dress and realized I was no longer asking to be chosen. One of the women, Marlene, messaged me after class. "Your words reminded me of when I stopped asking my daughter to return my calls. She still doesn't. But now it doesn't ache. Not the way it used to." And that message sat with me. I still hadn't heard from Jacob. Not even a half-hearted email. But now I understood. Some people only reach for you when you make yourself small. And when you finally stand tall, they act like you've abandoned them. But I wasn't abandoning anyone. I was simply choosing myself. One morning, I ran into Amanda's mother at the market. She looked surprised, maybe a little uncomfortable. I was holding a basket of tomatoes. She was in heels too high for hardwood floors. "Oh," she said. "Judith, I didn't know you still lived around here." "I do," I said plainly. "Haven't gone anywhere." There was an awkward pause. She shifted her weight. "Well, I hope things settle. Weddings are stressful." I smiled. Some stress reveals what was already broken. She didn't have a reply for that, and I didn't need one. I paid for my groceries and walked out with my head held high. Not out of pride, just out of peace. That evening, I pulled out a new notebook. On the first page, I wrote a single sentence. "You don't have to disappear just because they stop looking for you." I read it out loud. Not for anyone else, just for me. A few nights later, I sat outside with a glass of lemonade, watching the stars come out one by one. The porch was quiet, but I wasn't lonely. Because the difference between being alone and being invisible is this: now I choose my solitude. And when you start choosing yourself, the world begins to shift subtly, slowly but surely. I wasn't done healing, but I wasn't waiting to be rescued anymore either. And in that quiet strength, in that gentle reclaiming, I was beginning again. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Charlie showed up unannounced. He knocked like always, twice, then a pause, then one more. I opened the door and smiled. "You know, you don't have to knock, right?" He grinned. "It's polite. Besides, you might be in the middle of writing your next viral essay." I laughed, letting him in. "Not today. Today was a laundry and tea kind of day." He placed a paper bag on the kitchen counter. "I brought those lemon cookies you like from the farmer's market." "Are you bribing me for something?" I teased. He scratched his head. "Sort of. I actually need to talk to you about something. It's a little delicate." We sat at the table. I poured tea. He didn't speak for a few seconds, just stared down at the mug like it held the answers. Then he said, "Dad reached out to me." I didn't flinch. I thought I might, but I didn't. "What did he say?" I asked calmly. Charlie hesitated. "He asked me if I thought you'd ever be open to talking again. He said, Amanda's been distant since the wedding. That she's been bringing up money, your letter, how you humiliated them." I smiled, but not out of amusement. "Of course she did." He continued. He didn't sound angry, Grandma. He sounded lost. I leaned back in my chair. "And what did you say?" "I told him I didn't know that you were finally at peace and I wasn't going to be the one to drag you back into anything." I reached over and squeezed his hand. "Thank you." He nodded, then added quietly. "He asked if you knew that Amanda returned most of the wedding gifts, that the marriage might not be going well." That gave me pause. Not because I wish them unhappiness. Truthfully, I didn't wish them anything at all, but because it reminded me how quickly appearances unravel when truth is pushed too far down. "I think he regrets what he allowed," Charlie said. "But I also think he still doesn't understand how deep it went." I looked out the window. The garden was blooming. Little signs of late summer, lavender swaying in the breeze, tomatoes nearly ripe. "I believe in forgiveness," I said. But I don't believe in forgetting who someone showed you they are. Charlie stayed quiet. I continued. If your father wants to talk, he knows where I live. But I won't go first. I already did that for years. He looked relieved. Maybe he thought I'd slam the door completely. Or maybe he feared I'd run back too quickly, but I was past either extreme. Later that evening, after Charlie left, I sat with that feeling. It wasn't bitterness. It wasn't revenge. It was clarity. You see, there's a moment in every woman's life, especially women like me, who've poured themselves into others, when you realize how much of your story was told in the background of someone else's spotlight. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. You can't go back to playing the role of the grateful ghost. That night, I did something I hadn't done in years. I pulled out an old photo album, one Jacob had made for me back in college. It was a Mother's Day gift. Inside were pictures of us. Me at PDA meetings, me cooking, me holding him after his first recital. On the last page, he'd written, "Thanks for being my reason to believe I could become someone." I stared at those words. Back then, he meant them. And maybe some part of him still did. But here's the truth no one tells you. Being a mother doesn't mean you stop deserving boundaries. It doesn't mean your worth is only measured in sacrifice. I closed the album and set it gently on the shelf. I didn't cry. I didn't write a reply. But I lit a candle. Not for Jacob. Not for Amanda. Not for closure. For me to mark a quiet decision. If the door ever opens again, I'll be standing, not waiting. The next morning, I made my usual tea, stepped into my usual shoes, and walked the same path to the cafe. Linda greeted me with a cheerful table for one. I smiled. Actually, maybe two today. I'm expecting someone, possibly. She raised an eyebrow, but said nothing, just handed me my tea. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was waiting for anyone to show up. I just felt ready. It arrived in a plain envelope. No return address, just my name, handwritten in that familiar slanted print I'd recognize anywhere. Jacob. I stared at it for a moment on the kitchen counter. I didn't rush to open it. Just let it sit there while I finished my tea, while the radio hummed in the background with old jazz standards and the scent of lavender from my windowsill drifted through the room. Eventually, I slid a butter knife under the flap and pulled the letter out. Mom, I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from. I can't blame you for that. I've replayed everything over and over, and I'm ashamed of how I let things happen. Amanda and I are separating. That's not your burden. But I want you to know it. I also want you to know that I've been thinking about everything, about the way I took your help and pushed your presence aside, about the letter, about how much truth it held. Charlie's been right about a lot, especially about how I lost the one person who always showed up for me. There's a brunch at Aunt Lisa's this Sunday. Just family. I'll be there. So will Charlie. If you'd consider coming, I'd like to talk. I'd like to start again, but only if you want to. Love, Jacob. I folded the letter neatly and placed it back in the envelope. Then I walked out to the garden and stood among the tomatoes, now heavy and ripe, and let the breeze speak before I did. Start again. It sounded so simple. But I wasn't the same woman I had been weeks ago. I wasn't someone looking for scraps of kindness. I wasn't someone needing to be invited. And yet, I didn't feel angry. I felt still. That night I lay in bed wide awake, not anxious, not hopeful, just thinking. What does it mean to forgive someone who only learns to see you after you disappeared? What does it mean to show up not as a mother begging for recognition, but as a woman who knows her worth? I had the answer by sunrise. Sunday morning came, clear and cool. I wore a soft blue blouse, the one Harold once said made me look like spring had landed on my shoulders. I didn't do anything dramatic. No makeup, no heels, just dignity and calm. The brunch was at Lisa's home, a familiar house with a wide front porch and mismatched patio chairs. Charlie met me at the car. "You look strong," he said. "I am," I replied. He smiled, then offered his arm. I didn't take it out of weakness. I took it because walking beside someone who sees you is a gift, not a crutch. When I stepped onto the patio, heads turned. Jacob stood up from a wicker chair, napkin still in hand, and froze. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Lisa rose, too. Judith, she said carefully, it's good to see you. I nodded. Thank you. It's good to be seen. We Saturday. At first, the conversation was light. Weather, peach jam, someone's new job. I didn't push. I didn't perform. And when there was finally a lull, Jacob turned toward me. Mom, he said quietly. I'm sorry. Just that. No excuses, no disclaimers, just sorry. I let the silence settle a little before responding. I accept your apology, I said. But you need to know that I've built a life these last few weeks where I don't measure myself by how much I'm needed. He nodded slowly. I understand. I'm not here to return to the old patterns, I continued. If we're starting again, it won't be me giving while you look away. He reached across the table, not to grab my hand, but to set down a small box. Inside was a copy of the photo album I'd once given him. The one I thought he'd lost. The one with pictures of us years ago. I found this, he said. I forgot how much you were always there and how little I thanked you for it. I didn't cry, but my hand stayed on the box longer than necessary. Have you ever stood face to face with someone who hurt you and heard them finally say, I'm sorry? Like they actually meant it. Did you forgive them? Did you walk away? Or did you choose peace this time for yourself? If you've ever been at that kind of crossroads, I'd love to hear from you. Sometimes the quietest victories are the ones nobody else sees, but they're the ones that change everything. Later, as people started to leave, Jacob walked me to the car. I don't know if we'll ever get back to what we had, he said. I looked at him gently. Maybe we're not supposed to. Maybe we're meant to build something better. He nodded. And for the first time in a long time, he looked like the boy who once held my hand in parking lots, afraid of the world. I drove home with the windows cracked, the afternoon breeze playing with my hair. I wasn't back. I was moving forward. And that made all the difference. 3 weeks after the brunch, I put a for sale sign in front of my house. Not because I needed to leave in a hurry, not because I was running, but because for the first time in my life, I wanted a space that belonged to this version of me. Not the mother who packed lunches and paid mortgages. Not the widow who grieved in silence. Not the woman who stood politely on the sidelines of her own life. This time the space would start with me. I found a small cottage an hour outside the city near a lake, tucked between groves of maple and pine. No gate, no manicured lawn, just a crooked mailbox and a front porch that creaked like it was laughing at the years. The moment I stepped inside, I knew this wasn't a place for guests. This was a place to rest, to write, to remember who I was before I became everyone else's support beam. I didn't tell Jacob until the papers were signed. When I did, he asked quietly, "Is this because of me?" "No," I said gently. "It's because of me." That answer seemed to sit heavy in the air, but he nodded. "I'd like to visit sometime," he added. "You can," I replied. "But next time, ask if it's okay first." He smiled at that because he knew the rules had changed. I left most of the furniture behind. I took only what I loved, my books, my tea kettle, Harold's sketches, the little stained glass lamp Charlie made in 10th grade. On move-in day, I opened all the windows and let the breeze in. There was no nameplate on the mailbox, no welcome mat, just the sound of birds and the click of my own breath. And you know what I realized? Peace isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the way the floor doesn't creak where it used to. The way no one's waiting for you to cook dinner, the way your phone stays quiet, and it doesn't feel like loneliness. It feels like space. One morning, I sat by the lake with my journal and wrote, "This is not the second chapter of my life. It's the first one I'm writing for me." I read that line out loud, and it didn't echo. It landed. I started saying no more often. No to favors I didn't want to do, no to last-minute calls for help that came with no gratitude. But I also started saying yes to hikes, to art classes, to invitations from people who didn't see me as a background character. And it felt good. It felt like home. One evening, Charlie came to visit. He brought homemade chili and 2 spoons. He looked around and said, "You know, Grandma, this feels like you." I smiled. That's because I didn't decorate for anyone else. We ate quietly, watching the sunset ripple over the lake. Then he asked, "Do you miss the city? The noise? The people?" I shook my head. I spent years surrounded by noise and still felt invisible. Here, the quiet sees me. He didn't say anything after that. He didn't have to. We sat for a long time and I thought, maybe the real story isn't that I was cast out of my son's wedding. Maybe the real story is that when I was told to get out, I finally walked into my life. Autumn came quickly in the woods, the maple trees blushed early, throwing red and gold leaves across my porch like confetti for a party I hadn't asked for, but welcomed anyway. One chilly morning, I received an email from Jacob. The subject line just said, "Updates." Inside, a few lines, "Mom, Amanda moved out. We finalized the separation last week. She's moving back to New Jersey. I'm not asking for anything. I just thought you should know. I've been thinking a lot about how quiet my apartment is now. For the first time, I'm starting to realize what your silence really meant all those years. I hope you're well, Jacob." I sat with that email for a long time. Not because it hurt, but because he finally understood. Not the letter, not the money, not even the moment he let his bride scream, "Get out," at me. He understood the silence, the way I had lived, unsupported and unrecognized, while making sure everyone else was held. And now he was sitting in his own version of it, not as punishment, not because I wanted revenge, but because life has a way of giving back what you hand out. And Jacob had spent too many years handing out silence in my direction. Later that week, I got a call from Lisa, his aunt. She asked if I'd come to the next family dinner. "Just dinner," she said. "No drama, no Amanda, just people who miss having your voice at the table." I said I'd think about it, and I did. But the truth was, I didn't miss that table anymore. I had built a new one. Small, sturdy, no extra seats, unless someone brought respect with them. Instead, I sent Lisa a handwritten card, "Thank you for the invitation. I hope dinner is warm and laughter comes easy. I'm doing well, Judith." No explanation, no excuse. Just the way I wish they had treated me all those years ago. One afternoon, Charlie called from his college dorm. "Grandma," he said, "you won't believe this. Dad came to the writing workshop on campus." I nearly dropped my mug. He didn't participate, Charlie went on, just sat in the back. But afterward, he said something that surprised me. "What?" He said, "Your grandma's words made me realize she never wanted applause. She just wanted to be heard." That stopped me cold because that was the truth, wasn't it? I never wanted to be worshipped, just witnessed. But sometimes people can't give you that until you disappear. And then they start to realize all the ways you filled the space they now sit in alone. Have you ever stepped away from a place or a person who never saw you, only to find out later your absence said more than your presence ever could? If you have, I want you to know something. That's not weakness. That's wisdom. Sometimes you have to go quiet so the world can hear you. I didn't write Jacob back right away. I didn't jump into the car and drive to his apartment to rescue him from his regret because that wasn't my job anymore. I had a lake. I had books. I had mornings that started with bird calls, not burdens. That weekend, I walked to the farmer's market, bought a butternut squash, and sat on my porch with a new recipe and a warm sweater. And I smiled, not because everything was perfect, but because the silence, the same one that once felt like a rare, now sounded like freedom. I sat at my desk in the cottage just as dawn broke, the lake outside glowing pink. My laptop was open to my blog dashboard. I stared at the empty draft and took a deep breath. Then I began to type. If you're ever cast out of someone's party, don't sit at the edge waiting to be invited back. Build your own feast. Set your own table. Invite yourself. And when they ask why you're not there, simply remind them you were never invisible, you just chose to be elsewhere. I paused, read it aloud to the empty room, then hit publish. Within minutes, notifications popped up. Hundreds, then thousands of shares and comments rolled in. This is exactly how I felt when my daughter disowned me. Thank you for giving me words to say what I couldn't. My mother always loved me, but life made us strangers. I'm sharing this. I smiled, my heart warm. This was the quiet revolution I wanted. Real people finding strength in my words. Next, I printed 20 copies of the letter I'd already sent to Hollow Creek Vineyard Management weeks ago. Instead of drama, it simply stated, "I rescind all agreements and deposits due to disrespect shown to me as the groom's mother. Please consider this notice effective immediately." I slipped each copy into an envelope marked for your records and mailed them with a calm confidence. No rancour, just clear boundaries. That afternoon, I walked to the cafe where Martin and I often met. He waved from a corner table as I entered. The golden light of late afternoon filtered through stained glass windows, dust motes dancing in the beams. "Here she is," he said, standing to greet me, author of the moment. I laughed and replied, reader of my own words. We ordered peppermint tea and a slice of lemon cake. As we sipped, I watched the world outside, a mother pushing her child on a swing, a couple holding hands without urgency, a cat curled on someone's doorstep. "This feels good," Martin said. "You look at peace." "I am," I replied. "I've built my feast." We sat together, comfortable companions, letting silence speak as we watched the sky blush toward evening. Later, back in my cottage, I prepared for bed. The cottage felt smaller now, in a good way. It was mine, and I'd filled it with exactly what I wanted: books, art, memories untainted by obligation. I paused at the picture frame on my nightstand. Harold in his engineering uniform, that embarrassed smile, holding the tool he was so proud of. Next to it, a sketch he'd made of us dancing in the living room. Me barefoot, him stumbling and laughing. I whispered as I turned down the covers, "Thank you, Alfred," using the nickname he gave me on our first anniversary for seeing me. Then I slid under the quilt, arms hugging the warmth, and closed my eyes. No regret, no longing, just the soft hum of my own heartbeat. A lullaby stronger than any apology I ever received. Have you ever been excluded from someone's life only to discover you had the power to create something better on your own? How did you set your own table? Share your story below. Your voice deserves to be part of this feast.